Hello, so today I'm here with Nathanael from Santa Barbara in California, in America. Welcome, Nathanael, and thank you very much for joining me to talk today about how you use this inquiry-based stress reduction process, the work in organizations. So are you able to tell me a little bit about your program? And one of the things that I'm really interested in is you speak about leadership development is an inside job. So are you able to tell me what about that?
Yeah, and thanks, Karen, first of all, for having me on. I think you're doing a great service to gather some perspectives for how the work is moving in business. So I hope it serves a lot of people. Leadership is an inside job. It's really interesting just to say the phrase leadership development when the leadership training industry is by and large training oriented, which means it's a start and stop affair. It's a 2-day type of event. Maybe you can find programs that are months long, but seldom do you get into the realm of long-term practice. So I can speak about the work from a few standpoints. One would be the leadership and organizational development consultancy that I run, how we work inside of organizations. And of course, we start with the executive teams first and then work down the organization. The other place is framing the work for people who like YPO or EO forum retreats, and then of course in one-on-one coaching. And each one's a little bit different because when you're tasked with having to frame the work to a new audience and why to get enrolled in doing it, the business worldview, the business mindset is very Western, objective, data, results, performance. So there's quite a heavy lift at the top to enroll people in the why and to speak into their hearing in a way that they can get on board with it. So that, of course, is a bigger challenge than someone whose mind is already open to wanting to do the work. And then, of course, that has its own series of challenges along with it. So leadership being an inside job is actually a big part of how I'd frame it to anyone. And so the first part of that, even in a PowerPoint that I've put together for kind of an opening evening orientation, has a lot to do with looking at a very simple notion, which I believe is trending in leadership development these days, which is horizontal learning versus vertical development. So if you think about that for a minute, are you putting more tools in your toolkit? Are you getting more information as you might in the training? Or are you really upgrading your operating system? Are you going to the next level of your own leadership development? Are you upgrading the tool user, him or herself? So that alone is a big idea. And we can use a lot of metaphors to, like the operating system, to talk about vertical development. So I'd pause there and say that's one big idea that I have people anchor on. And then they also will get the notion that organizations also can be functioning at different levels.
Well, an organization is none other than a group of individuals, the individuals that operate in it. So if you deal with each individual and the way each individual is operating, it has to have an impact on the overall organization, does it not?
Yeah, exactly so. And so what we'll look at, and I'll show them data on the new types of organizations that exist in the world these days. So if you look at conventional organizations and you benchmark them against the S&P 500, you can take the old good to great companies and put them on that same XY. And then you look at conscious capitalism, businesses that explicitly are conscious businesses that have a purpose beyond making a profit, have a stakeholder orientation versus a shareholder orientation where they're just extracting value. But there's an interdependence, not just an independence. So already you have these very simple binary current level, next level. And then they go, oh my God, these companies who are conscious, they outperform the S&P, they outperform the good to great companies, firms of endearment, as they call them. And so this is a whole new way of doing business that has a next level, a more complex way of viewing the marketplace. And so the companies that care about something more than making money make more money. So you're speaking into their hearing a little bit. Same thing with exponential organizations or with deliberately developmental organizations. Look at a company like Bridgewater that has the most successful hedge fund on the planet. They're clearly running a different operating system. So once you get them to looking at the financial returns, like tens to hundreds of percentage points more than conventional companies, now they're going to start to perk up and go, okay, well, how do I get my organization to the next level? And we know the answer to that. It's what you just said. So we would joke that leaders get the organization they deserve. It's a reflection of their own leadership. You can't say, who hired all these idiots? You can't say, who approved these product lines?
Yeah.
There's something inherently self-reflective about being a leader because you're accountable, you're responsible. And that's another key idea that they're really going to anchor on with the work, because what is it about? It's about 100% personal responsibility, the willingness to look in the mirror. And so that, once you get that down, then they're going to start to become interested. And the good to great premise was every company that was a great company had one thing in common, several things in common, which is what the book is about. But they all had what they called level 5 leaders.
Yeah.
That paradoxical combination of personal humility and professional drive. And yet they didn't know how to create one.
Yeah.
But they knew that it was the vertical development to that stage that caused those companies to be successful. So now you have, well, how do I get to my leadership to the next level so I can have a company like that performs with that new operating system and gets next level results? So this is some of the feel, or at least one angle that I've used to start to lay the groundwork for why do the work, why lead from the inside out.
And so tell me about the program that you've developed. And I know you've had some experience with organizations, like working in organizations, using the work in organizations. So how has the program that you've got now evolved from that experiential work that you have in using the work with those leaders in an organization?
I would even say one thing before answering that, which is something I assume as a facilitator of the work. And I would also tie it in, even in the orientation. John Mackey, who founded the Conscious Capitalism Association and Whole Foods and so on, he would say, every time I had a breakthrough, Whole Foods, the organization, had a breakthrough.
Yeah.
And every time I was ready to have another breakthrough, Whole Foods would show me because of what I was complaining about in Whole Foods.
Yeah.
So when we look at development, we're going beyond this typical mature achiever self-authoring mindset into a true self-transforming mindset. And what I'm judging out there is just a mirror for me to work on my own leadership. So I have to say, and we all are committed to this with the work, that if I didn't have the work and I wasn't working my worksheets where I was triggered with my clients because I was getting what I thought I wanted or not, I would not be in a sane place, and certainly not where I am today. So all growth to me is that evolutionary growth. It comes from the willingness to be disrupted.
Yep.
And so to grow. So I'm the only one who needs to grow in context of working with clients. And then, of course, when I change myself, the dynamic changes, and then they change or not. So having said that, I've done 2 different programs with business leaders. One is an open enrollment where CEOs came from different businesses and they were together doing the work for 6 months. We had quarterly workshops. We actually had at the midpoint teleconference with Katie. And then week to week, we had team calls. And then executive coaching was part of that. And of course, a very detailed implementation plan of theory and practice assignments. So watch this, read this, do this, write this one belief list, work it with your partner. So a really robust curriculum. And the other approach, which I'm really just working through in the last year and a quarter or so, is inside of an organization with the intent of it cascading all the way through. Now that's part of what I'm up to uniquely. I'm committed to disrupting the leadership training space. So we at Palystra will only partner with businesses who want to build leadership training permanently into their business. We don't offer trainings at all. So showing up to work is showing up to practice, and it doesn't stop. It's not a start and stop affair. So that's been quite a different endeavor, and some good learning along the way too with how to frame it and position it. And frankly, what also to there's a delivery system. You have a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. The work as a practice or as a tool can be set in context. It can be set in context of the delivery system that helps it be digested. Now, the work itself as a tool never changes. The integrity of that remains intact. And there's a broader toolkit, which frankly also can come from Katie's 9-day school, or once you're an ITW, all the feedback loops that go on. There's a very rich organizational leadership and organizational development toolkit that's kind of hidden in plain sight with everything Katie's offered just within the school of ITW.
Well, it's interesting for me because my own way of thinking about the work, whilst Katie talks about the work as those 4 questions and the turnarounds, and I understand that, for me, the total context of it, of all of those things that we speak about, whose business are you in, the noticing, your behaviour, all of those additional things that are there, the feedback loop, they're all part for me of the work in its entirety, the way that I see it. And so for me, sometimes I think they're the important places to start even, just to have people really start to become aware of themselves and how they do react in a given situation. They're not always ready to perhaps dive into going straight into the questions, and yet the noticing can be of great value to them.
Yeah, and even specifically, let's look at, I know this is going out to a lot of people, so not to reveal what's inside of the school, but at a capsule level, as Katie would say, there's a whole capsule on communication.
Yeah.
Everything in her second book. It's communicating clearly,
yes.
An honest yes or no, conflict resolution,
yep.
The gift of criticism. Oh my God, such a rich organizational development, team development toolkit.
Yep.
And then once you get into ITW, the most basic feedback loop that we learn is what worked for me is,
yes.
What didn't work for me is, or what I do differently is.
Yeah.
And just to start to bring that into an organization, when you talk about continuous improvement through feedback, that is an incredible tool. And to bring the other thing that's trending in leadership training is, as I would say, everyone has a coach and everyone is a coach. So paired partner practice that cultivates coaching competencies, builds trust.
Yes.
And when you're also getting feedback on what's working and not working, you're starting to create a feedback-rich environment that frankly removes a lot of the ego sensitivities that people have. So there is one big thing. If evolution or growth happens through feedback, and we don't see business growth as separate from people growth, then removing the ego's defenses so that it can actually hear the feedback is an incredible unlocking move. And of course, it's kind that we have the work first, so that as we hear feedback and get triggered or upset, we know what to do with those moments. We take them to the work. But that's maybe to speak to what the effort of really onboarding the work into an organization or into any group of people really requires. And it is a fairly, in my experience, it's a fairly complex activity. And what I mean by that, there's some very basic blocking and tackling, some of the pieces I just mentioned. Basic coaching skills. Do you even ask questions? like inquiry versus advocacy. Most organizations are armed with advocacy, meaning they love to tell, they love to discuss, they love to debate. Just introducing active listening, let alone some basic coaching skills, so that people begin to ask questions in addition to just say what they think. That's a lot for some people. And so basic skills around feedback, to put some of the communication capsule pieces together with the work in an organizational initiative is very helpful. Now, if you're doing a retreat or you have a training, of course, it's very helpful just to stay laser focused on the work. And if that's the objective, just to deliver the work, then there's a few really important, what I see is really more than guidelines, like best practices, we could say, for how to help people who have that worldview, business worldview, really get open and enrolled around doing it. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit too, if that serves as well. Yeah, so given once again that who are we dealing with? We want to meet people where they're at. And that's an act of kindness, and that's an act of skillful means to connect before we lead people to a new place. So when I think about people in business, keep in mind people will or will not have meditated ever in their life. So when Katie says the work is meditation, yes, that's true. And we have to break that down and understand that just meditating, meaning sitting in stillness and drifting and coming back to your breath, that's the whole practice they may have never done before. And then to do the work, inquiry on top of that, is on something that you're emotionally triggered about, that you have to hold a very precise time and location in your head while you answer these questions and do what are these things called turnarounds, and why do we do these? So there's a lot, and just to slow it down, I've found has been really helpful. It's the first thing. And so what that means is to have enough time to slow down. And if you do have 2 days to dedicate to it, like an evening and 2 days, that would be phenomenal. And I think to be mindful too, if you're going to open it up at all, is there enough aftercare, is there enough support on the back end that they don't try to go home and weaponize it and ask people, is it true, and turn it around, all this kind of stuff. We want to make sure they have the support to really learn how to do it well. And so if you can't do 2 days at the top, it's possible in a day or an afternoon. And I would hope that you have weekly calls to supplement any in-persons that you have, or weekly inquiry circles, or work sessions, as I like to call them, in that language. And then getting right into the specifics of even the Judge Your Neighbor worksheet. There's been one thing that's been so important in that for me. Just leading a call last week with a group of executives who are new to it. Number one can be confusing because it says number one is the situation. Actually, it's not. The situation is the situation, time, and location. So if I asked you, Karen, what's the situation, and I'm coaching you, you would describe it to me. Well, I'm standing in the garage and my husband left the garage door open again. So I'm upset with my husband because he left the garage door open again. Now, this is very confusing for people with more data-oriented, objective mindsets. And what I say is the facts belong in the situation. Let's separate the objective facts from the subjective interpretations. And even on the worksheet, it says who angers, confuses, irritates you, and why. So you're invited to offer your subjective judgment of the situation. And if you are holding that precise time and location, it's all there anyway. So, and that's the other thing, the pause button, as we say in ITW, that they have that very precise moment in time. So it's not 20 different situations. It's really just meditating on that one moment, and really offering feedback and coaching and spending quite a bit of time just there in number one. Otherwise, you can, well, I'll put it this way, you can spare yourself a lot of time later getting confused in turnarounds when people are trying to turn around facts. And for people who are just new to it, it's enough to just separate those two. They can go to the nobody later and question everything. And in the beginning, I found that just as a very tactical piece of information to be really, really helpful and important.
And what's the feedback from the executives and people that you've worked with been?
So a full spectrum here as well. I've had people who say, nope, I'm not going to do that. I guess that they went on the internet and found Katie and read something negative and talked themselves into not even trying it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you're in a much more sophisticated team dynamic with the CEO wants it for his team, and you show up with the CEO and suddenly, what is all this stuff we're doing? I didn't sign up for this.
Mm-hmm.
And yet if you're responsible for holding the integrity of the leadership engagement, now there's a dynamic going on where if someone doesn't want to buy in and do what's being asked, it could threaten their job. So again, worksheets keeps me clear so that I'm staying in my own business and also holding the integrity of what I'm being asked to do by my client, which is the CEO.
Mm-hmm.
So it can get very rich if people are not buying in. And that's on the one end of the spectrum, all the way to what I did instead, because we couldn't launch it until this year as an executive team, as an explicit curriculum capsule. I would do it one-on-one in the coaching sessions. And even with the CEO in our history before him bringing me to work with his team, it was, as we say, the unlocking move from the beginning. There's a few other pieces of the content, but the work was always like, oh my God, this is incredible. And that darn mirror, every time I get in the session, I think, I'm going to get Nathanael this time. Nothing's going to get turned around on this one. And then by the end of just a regular session in a business context, it is so fascinating to watch their minds because they're so sharp.
Yeah.
I mean, these are very sophisticated business minds, and to take that mind and put it to work in the work and the kind of examples of what it has really to do with leadership and personal ownership and influence, it's really beautiful. And I know that the team as it exists today, it's really turned around in terms of not only who's on the team, and again, make no mistake about it, it can be very disruptive to do this work. But that's all high performance teamwork, OD interventions. Even if you're just onboarding like a strategic planning process, they say 80% of the time there's a staffing change. Now, when you really get into doing deeper work and people start writing worksheets on each other, things will boil and whatever's not aligned will come to the surface quicker.
Yeah.
And yet again, with the work, we have the tools we need to navigate our way through whatever conflicts do arise, and the result is alignment. And it's incredibly powerful. And just the flow of feedback now that every week they get on the mat and they have time to exchange feedback, and then we're partnering up and doing the work. So from the standpoint of just the smallest thing that can make the biggest difference, regular practice of the work, and then whatever supports that. And honestly, the feedback I'm hearing about reading Loving What Is, again, on the one hand, you might not want to have Katie's face anywhere. And just, you could call it the work, you could call it inquiry. I think calling it the work still fits the business worldview. But as and when they're ready for it, I think it's absolutely wonderful to have the context of Loving What Is and videos of Katie facilitating. And if they're not ready for that, it's absolutely can be way too disruptive. So the skillful means, again, is to meet people where they're at and make sure that you're selecting the right approach for the right situation. But they're loving what is. And I realize too that sitting in other people's work, sitting in what the operating system is, what does a clear mind sound like? How do you communicate clearly?
Yeah.
I think that's so important too.
And So how would you talk to, or what would you talk to if there was an organization that had a lot of stress in the organization? So this is what there's a risk of a lot of stress and a lot of the chance, so here in Australia, where people will put in a claim for workers' compensation, stress-related workers' compensation, and it's quite a huge, companies here in Australia spend $10 billion a year on workers' compensation for stress-related claims, which is a lot of money. And in that, there's 70% of people that are stressed at work that don't put in a workers' compensation claim. And what often happens here is organizations and managers or leaders will become stressed themselves, not necessarily be aware of what's happening with their employees, and yet they'll go straight to performance management. Because that's the way that they know and the way that they've been told to deal with someone who's not performing.
Yeah. So this can go a few different directions, and to go straight to performance management for me is part of the old way, the old paradigm of human resources, and even talent management is still about optimizing people to get something out of them. Mm-hmm. So to upgrade the operating system, what you look at what organizations are doing is they have internal people development. They have whole departments dedicated to it. So Google doesn't have a human resources department; they have people development, and within that is HR.
Yep.
So the languaging around it, I would say it's time to split HR or integrate HR, but human development is very different from human resources. And when you have actually a function, a vertical within the organization that the executive team reports directly to first, meaning it's the executive team, speaking of leading from the inside out, or leaders go first, they are the ones who are modeling the culture of high performance and transparency and vulnerability and feedback and continuous improvement. And that sets the tone. So I would joke and say that if you don't start at the top and you just have a department dedicated to fixing people when they are stressed out, then it's kind of like, we had a client come to us once and say, I was having trouble with my wife, so I hired her a therapist. And we said, well, how did that go? Well, not so well. Of course, same thing, well, I'm having trouble with my kids, so I dropped them off at therapy once a week. Yeah. So it's humorous, and people loosen up around that because they see that, again, change begins within. It starts at the top. And yet, we don't just work with people at the top. It's everyone. It's universal all the way through the organization. And then, of course, you look at the data, even just talent management, the people who do endeavor to develop every individual in their organization, well, the returns are compounded because everyone is growing.
Yeah.
So to your point, you could do a training-based approach. And for me, I would be really interested in seeking the highest first and going to the CEO and making a more strategic case for why it starts at the top and what the cost savings are associated with that. Now, it may be one and then the other, or some combination of both. But yeah, I think that's any data points that show them the return on investment is obviously really helpful for guys like this.
Yeah.
And not to be able to cherry pick around the people who are really ripe for it, and not to have to force it with anyone if that's not really if they're not really up to wanting to learn and grow and develop and do the work actually themselves, and it becomes a lot tougher to go downstream or into a department unless there's a leader of some intact team at that level, in my experience.
Yeah, and Ernest, in his interview with me, was discussing the same thing. He spoke to me about those different groups of people, the ones that are just not interested, and they're not interested, and it's like a waste of time, their time and effort in a way. I mean, sure, they might learn the tool, but they're not interested in it. And then there's the middle third who are somewhat interested, and then they're just not sure, and they don't want to commit the time. And then there's the top third that really jump into it and are the ones that are ready for it, right for it, will take it and run with it. And as we know, it only takes one person to make an impact for any change. It's personal, and yet one person doing it will have a flow through and impact those others around them anyway. So it doesn't necessarily need to be everybody that does it.
Mm-hmm. And what have you found with the workers' comp claims? What's been your experience about what people are
this
hearing?
is part of why I'm doing these interviews, is to help Australia become aware that there are other tools and practices available to them to use to support changing that. Because at the moment there's difficulty in how to change that mindset in an organisation. And so it's the reason for me doing these interviews with you and the others from around the world who are using this in organisations already, to say, well, look, here is a tool that does work in organisations for this sort of thing, if you're open to exploring it. So, yeah. That's
great. I think that brings me back to the whole point about the old languaging versus the new operating system. Mm. And we would say performance coaching, and that every manager is a coach. And that's how they optimize, not just optimize, but that's how they help develop the people who report to them. Yeah. And that's a responsibility that someone can begin to take on if they have a tool like the work. And that, again, everyone is a coach, everyone has a coach. That partnering up and practicing together also builds a team mindset. Yeah. And trust and so on. So, yeah, I think that when people even start to catch on to, oh, there's a new way, and it's also what's trending, and you can point to examples of where it's been successful in other businesses, really successful businesses, then then the people who are in the middle third can become the leading third. Yeah. Because we've spoken into their hearing in a way that they start to light up and go, okay, I'm willing to go through doing something new that could be uncomfortable and even painful. And otherwise selling transformation or offering transformation is a difficult thing to sell, because you may or may not transform. It will be likely fairly painful along the way. And and so support, I think, coming back to support and meeting people where they're at so they can feel comfortable taking on what frankly is one of the more confronting practices that we have in our toolkit with inquiry, with the work and inquiry-based stress reduction. And of course, what business people love is the concept of work. So they know that they're called the work for nothing, and yet doing real work gets real results. And, in that regard, the work is still the most impactful, transformative tool I do have. So everything points to that. Even if I don't start with it, it certainly is where I intend to arrive.
And just one last question: how do you deal with people, or how are people talking about emotions in the workplace? Because I know here it's like you don't put the word emotions or feelings and work in the same sentence, and yet, as we know, when we do the work, we go into that feeling place. It's the place that we start. So what are you noticing there?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is that the structure of the work is very appealing because it's so structured. It's not talk therapy. So it's not as if you're bringing something therapeutic to work. And part of what these new organizations are seeing is that personal and professional lives aren't so separate, that the interior is part of what's managed and coached. Yeah. And that if you can unlock people's personal trigger points and stressors that they have at home, then they won't bring them to work. And if you can keep things in continuous improvement is all about eliminating waste. It's like the oil in the machine. And what happens if, I had a CEO say last week, like, I can't imagine that we wouldn't have had this work session where I have my worksheet on my business partner, the president of the company. I can't imagine what it would be like if I hadn't gotten to do this worksheet. And then I get on an airplane and bring that stress with me into the rest of my week. Yeah. So there's a way of speaking to the relationship between them and also, again, relying on the structure so that they can take baby steps and not have to spend 30 minutes in question 3 or something. It's just, how do you react when you believe the thought? Well, I feel stressed. I feel upset. I feel frustrated. The more masculine emotions maybe come out.
Yeah.
And that can be a great help. And also to that point, when they get to question 4, I think this is part of the skillful means of knowing that in question 4, it's not just that I would accept everything the way it is and do nothing about anything. It's that I'm also empowered to say, or what would you say or do without the thought?
Yes.
And then their coaching hat can come out, and then they can be even more clear and directed in the requests they're making of people. So there's a way of them starting to see that there's simply 2 ways to interact with someone. One is stressed and in a drama triangle, in a victim mindset, and the other is empowered and clear, fearless, effective. That's leadership. So I think within the work, there are ways of tuning it, as always, that still support the integrity of the process. And that's one last thing actually I'd like to say is objective mindsets, the kind of Western worldview, unless they have a chance to discuss and debate, it'll be in their worries about what's going to happen if they do the work will be in the back of their head. Mm-hmm. So what I found really works is either at the top or on the back end, having a lot of time for Q&A. And then as facilitators, we have to be really equipped and on our toes. Well, we don't have to be. It helps and supports if we have really clear, rational answers.
Yeah.
Like all the commonly asked questions about, well, doesn't it just mean that I would not care about anything or wouldn't be passionate?
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to field those questions and respond with a fairly nuanced kind of yes and here's my experience of that kind of way. So if they experience your own integrity and solidity and you're doing your own work, then there's nothing to sell. It's authentic. And there's no other power than that. It's authenticity.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nathanael, for talking with me today. It's been another really valuable interview and information for me. So I really, really appreciate your time, and you'll be able to find information on Nathanael's organization at the end slide for this presentation if you're interested in finding out more. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate it.